Let me start by saying that probably over the last 20 years, the term politician has a pretty negative spin to it. Even the words Republican, or Democrat, or Independent, Liberal, Conservative, can be spoken with great disdain. But the problem with that is that there are some great selfless public servants who go to work every day around this country of ours, serving you and I, as I indicated, in a selfless manner. I've known Andy Card for over probably 22 years now, and he is a dear friend of mine. When I think of a politician, when I think of a selfless servant, I think of Andy. In many ways, he's like Cincinnatus. I think most of you know the story of this great Roman senator who was relieved of his duties in the Senate and crossed the Tiber River to work on a farm. And when Rome came under threat of attack, the senators went back to Cincinnatus and said, please come back to Rome. And he came back to Rome as what some history books call a, quote, dictator, where he, in fact, took over the army and defeated the enemy. And instead of staying in power, went back to the farm. Andy's from Massachusetts, not from Rome. And I think he probably does have a little farm up there. But that's how he lived his life. When called, Andy came to serve. And when he was finished serving, there was not a whole lot of self involved in anything. He just went back to his precious wife and to their family. He served under 3 presidents. He served in the cabinet. He served as the transition officer between a Republican and a Democratic administration. And in each instance, he served in an outstanding manner, selfless almost to a fault. So when I think of politicians, I don't think of them with disdain, because I always think of a dear friend of mine, Andy Card. And it's with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce somebody who is a friend of Birmingham-Southern College and a dear friend of my own, Andy Card.
Wow. When General Krulak suggested that I could come visit him at his campus, I never expected an audience like this. This is a phenomenal audience, and what a treat it is for me to stand in front of you and be able to share some thoughts with you. I am a very blessed person, and the truth is, you are phenomenally blessed too. We live in a great country. And a lot of people will not give a lot of thought to this, but this is a very, very, very important week for our country. On September 17th, we celebrate the birthday of our Constitution. And it's amazing how many Americans don't even know that. We all know the Declaration of Independence, and that was kind of the fun part, because we told somebody else we didn't like them. But the Constitution is the exciting part, because it's when a government was formed, and they told us it was our government. And the truth is, it took quite a while after that 1776 rallying cry for us to get it right and form a government. they actually had a couple of fits and starts. The Continental Congress kind of didn't get it right, even though they called themselves the United States of America, and we had a president that wasn't kind of a president that had anything to really do. And then we got a constitution written, and that was September 17th, 1787, when it was done, and it went off to the states for ratification. And the states, pretty quickly, given the fact that you had to communicate without benefit of a handheld device, got it done. And they ratified the Constitution. But they ratified the Constitution on a promise. And the promise was that there would be a Bill of Rights added to it before it had been in place very long. And that Bill of Rights is pretty remarkable, because the Bill of Rights said, not only does the Constitution say it's your government, you can have a say about it. In fact, most people today define the Constitution by the First Amendment to the Constitution rather than the Constitution itself. And you know that we have the right to practice our faith any way we want. We have the right to speak about our government any way we want. We have the right to gather with whomever we want. There's another institution called the press, but you can never find where that institution is, by the way. But that institution has a lot of rights. They can write about the government any way they want. But you're also invited to petition government in that First Amendment. To petition government to address your grievances. And we do a lot of petitioning these days. A lot of people have been out there petitioning government. In fact, we're getting ready for the great petition, an election. But when you read the Constitution, and too few of us actually read it, but when you read the Constitution, you find that it's an amazing document that really only obligates a handful of us to do anything. The document itself is really just an invitation. It's an invitation to be involved in the government, because we don't have any obligation under the Constitution to get involved, unless we're invited. And since the document itself is a great invitation, some people answer the invitation. But when you think about it, too few people answer the invitation to serve. Not as many people as should answer the invitation to vote. Not very many people answer the invitation to actually show up for duty. But that's what the Constitution does. And I want to tell you, I am blessed to have come from a family that believed that the Constitution was really a remarkable document. And the invitation was an important invitation. And if I didn't accept the invitation, shame on me. And I did accept the invitation. Yes, I am from Massachusetts. I parked the car at Harvard Yard, and most of you do not know what I'm saying. I did get poorly educated at a great institution in the South, the University of South Carolina. And I say poorly educated because I got a great education about the substance of being an engineer, but I never learned how to talk right. So I apologize up front for saying my name is Andy Card. And that's C-A-R-D. You would write that as C-A-I-D. It's C-A-R-D. But I was taught that the Constitution gave us such a grand invitation that I had to accept it. And I was taught that by a family, my parents, but most significantly, my grandmother. Now, this was my father's mother, and she was a very, very remarkable woman, and she was quite well educated for her day. And she was a school teacher. And I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. I probably was driving my parents nuts, and that's why I was spent time over with my grandmother. My parents were also very young when I was born. They were 17 when I was born. But I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's. And she was very, very proud of something that hung in the dining room in her house. And it was a picture she claims of her. There were a lot of other people in the picture. I'm not sure that she was there, but I think she would never lie to me. But it was a picture that showed women wearing white dresses. And they were marching down Commonwealth Avenue in Boston. And they were called suffragettes. My grandmother had been a suffragette. And when women got the right to vote, she actually went up and registered to vote. And if you look at the records in my hometown of Holbrook, Massachusetts, where, by the way, I met my wife in the 5th grade, and I'm so glad she's here with me. My grandmother was the first woman to register to vote in my hometown, and women got the right to vote. And for those of you who don't know, it wasn't that long ago. It was 1920. And when women did get the right to vote, my grandmother not only voted, she actually ran for office. And she got elected to the school committee. And she loved serving on that school committee. And yes, she was controversial because she was a woman on the school committee. She was also pregnant while she was on the school committee with my dad. But she did a phenomenal job of inviting us to take the invitation that the Constitution has for all of us to get involved. So in my lifetime, politics was not a dirty word. It was a noble calling. At the dining room table, my grandmother would have us sit down to begin the meal, but before anybody could, start to think about eating, you had to offer a blessing, and we did. But before you could pick up your fork, my grandmother would ask us each to repeat something from the newspaper that day. I was great. Red Sox scores, Celtics scores, Bruins scores. The Patriots weren't playing then. Inevitably, every single dinner conversation ended up being about public policy, office holders, school committee budgets, Beacon Hill in Boston, or Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And we were all encouraged to participate in the discussion. In fact, we were discouraged from agreeing. We were taught to argue. And yes, there were some healthy arguments. When I went off to college, to the University of South Carolina, and I came back home to my hometown in Holbrook, my wife and I and our 2 kids, we moved in with my grandmother. And I was an engineer. But she asked what I was going to do for the community. And I ended up running for the planning board in Holbrook, Massachusetts, right out of college. Graduated in January. I was not on the 4-year plan. I got elected in March of 1971. It was a 5-year term. No pay. Thursday nights, cul-de-sacs, curb cuts, developments, and lots of arguments. And a wonderful experience. And my grandmother was so proud that I was serving in local government. Then my wife and I bought a house. And my grandmother came and lived with me. And we were so thrilled to have her there. But she was not young, and she was not well. And she got taken to the hospital on Christmas Eve, 1971. And I came home from work and went over to the hospital to visit her. And I was with my father and my brothers. And I went and sat down with my grandmother beside the bed, and she told us all that she was dying, but we shouldn't be sad because she'd lived a wonderful life. And she proceeded to talk all about the things in her life that made a difference. She was very proud of what she had done in education as a teacher, what she'd done on the school committee, what she'd done as a suffragette. And then she wanted to talk to each one of us alone. And I'm sitting with my grandmother, she's holding my hand and squeezing it. And then she says, Andy, tell me something from the newspaper today. And we proceeded to talk about Beacon Hill and Capitol Hill, what the congressman was doing, what the state rep was doing. How's that state senator doing? How's the president doing? What's the governor up to? What's the school committee budget now? Is the town clearing snow? You don't know what snow is, but is the town clearing snow? And then she squeezed my hand and started to cry. And she said, Andy, continue to participate in politics. Because if people don't participate in their government, democracy will die. She died that night. And she left me with the most wonderful curse. I have to participate. And you don't even have to agree. That curse, however, created opportunities beyond comprehension. I ended up running for the legislature in Massachusetts and losing and then winning. I won during a very tough year. It was 1974. That was the year of Watergate. Not a good year to be a Republican in Massachusetts. In fact, I can't think of a good year to be a Republican in Massachusetts. I got reelected in 76 and reelected in 78. Reelected in 1980. But during that period of time, I had some pretty remarkable invitations that came because of our Constitution. I got calls asking if I would like to help people run for president. And one of the calls came from someone I have grown to think has been recognized, rightfully so, as one of the greatest citizens in the history of our country. And that was George Herbert Walker Bush. And he asked if I would help in his campaign for the presidency, not as a paid person, but as a volunteer. And I did. But I remember when I was asked if I would join his campaign, and I wrestled with, is it the right thing for me to do? And this was when George Bush was an asterisk in the poll, and my friends all thought he was a cheap beer. I said yes. But the phone call that I made to accept the invitation to help him was made to someone who has a connection in this room. It was Tucker Tutwiler's sister, Margaret Tutwiler, who answered the call when I called James A. Baker III, who was the chairman of the campaign, to say, I'm signing on with George Herbert Walker Bush for President of the United States. And that changed my life. I want to fast forward. I don't want to walk you through my biography or tell you every experience. But I want you to know that the invitation to get involved in our political process is what created opportunities that I never even dreamed that I would have. And they led to a time that you will never forget. At least I hope you'll never forget it. that invitation to get involved created opportunities for me to understand something that very few people have a chance to understand. And that's how the White House works. Because the invitation to get involved in a campaign resulted in an invitation to join a White House staff, to serve President Reagan, to serve President George Bush I, and then to serve President George W. Bush. All positions were at the White House. And you know what? We tend not to recognize the White House for what it is. It's really the place where Article 2 in the Constitution exists. You know, Article 1, that's Capitol Hill. That's the House and the Senate. Article 2, that's personified by one person, the President of the United States. And I was invited to work for the personification of Article 2 in the Constitution. And I got to see lots of different sides of the challenge. But that invitation to come to the White House ended up being an invitation to serve beside a president in a job that you don't apply for, to be the president's chief of staff. My goal when I became the chief of staff was to be like my very favorite chief of staff, who was James A. Baker III. But I knew that I couldn't live up to all of what he had demonstrated. So my goal was to be a chief of staff that you didn't know his name. I wanted to keep those trains running on time, make sure all those difficult personalities found a way to get along, and that the president got the help he needed when he needed it in order to make tough decisions, and that they would be implemented to his expectations. But a beautiful day dawned on America, and a horrible attack took place. And you just had remembrance of that day. In fact, this college had a phenomenal remembrance of that day. 9/11. Yes, I'm the one who whispered in the president's ear and told him about the attack on America. So, if you don't mind, can I tell you about my most memorable day at the White House? And what remarkable responsibilities I saw being addressed by a remarkable president. The day of the attack, you'll never forget it. It was a beautiful day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky in the lower 48. It was a perfect day. And the president woke up in Sarasota, Florida, at a resort, the Colony Tennis and Racket Club. And he has made plans to go out for a run on the golf course. And it was going to be an interesting run and a bit of a challenging run. And you should know that all Bushes are very competitive. They're so competitive, they don't let their grandchildren beat them at anything. Well, President George W. Bush had invited a reporter to go for a run with him that morning. The challenge was that the reporter was really a good runner. In fact, he was an NCAA All-American cross-country runner. And I knew President Bush was going to go out on the golf course and take this run. And when I went in to see him, he said that he was going to run a record time, and he was nervous about it, but he was going to do it. I was concerned that he would get sick because the night before there was a terrible stench in the air, and I thought that he was going to get sick. I went to the doctor said he won't. I made a mistake of telling the president, don't worry, he won't get sick. And he looks at me like I'm an idiot. But he came back, he beat the reporter, and he was ready for an easy day. We did the CIA briefing, we piled into the limousine, we go to the M.E. Booker School. On the way in, there's a rumor of an attack, or not an attack, a plane crash in New York City. The president is then told it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The principal of the school opens the door of the classroom. The president walks into the classroom. The door shuts. I'm told that it wasn't a small twin engine prop plane, it was a commercial jetliner. I think of the fear of the passengers. Then the same staffer comes to me and says, oh my gosh, another plane is near the tower of the World Trade Center. I have to do what chiefs of staff have to do and say, does the president need to know? That's a hard question to answer most of the time. Made the decision, yes. I decided to pass on 2 facts, make 1 editorial comment. I open the door to the classroom. Ann Compton sees me come in and she goes, she's from ABC News. She says, I say, and Ann Compton goes, what? Then there's a break in the conversation. I go over to the president. I whisper into his right ear, a second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. That's all I said to him. I stood back from him so he couldn't ask me a question. No, I was not afraid. I just didn't want to have that dialogue in front of the students. Then I went back to the door of the classroom and walked back into the holding room, and I was really, really pleased the president stayed where he was. He did nothing to introduce fear to those very young kids. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media. Think how happy the terrorists would have been if the president had jumped up and screamed or fallen down in the fetal position or something. He also gave me a chance to get some work done. I could say, get the FBI director on the phone. Get a line open to the vice president. Get a line open to the situation. Get the crew back on Air Force One. To the Secret Service, I could say, turn the motorcade around. So staffers that were working in communications said, get some remarks written for the president. We've got a big crowd in a gymnasium right next door. When the president walked into that staff holding room, the first thing he did, everybody ran to him, by the way. And he says, get the FBI director on the phone. And we could say, he's right here, Mr. President. The rest of the day was remarkable. We went to Barksdale Air Force Base, Strategic Air Command. The president the whole time was pretty angry with me because he wanted to go back to Washington, D.C. You can read about that in his book. It's accurate. We made it back to Washington, D.C. He addressed the American people. And I want to tell you what happened after that. We'll never forget that day. And the truth is, you shouldn't remember it because of anything I did. You should remember it because of the sacrifice of so many innocent people. And the first responders that answered the call to duty and then were killed themselves. And you should remember it because of the heroes on Flight 93. They were completely unselfish and made a decision to sacrifice themselves to save other lives in the first counterattack in the War on Terror. That's what I want you to remember about that day. But now I want to tell you about my most memorable day at the White House. It came after September 11th. The dust had started to settle. The fog of war had started to lift. You could see the hole in the Pentagon. You heard the cries of the loved ones as they learned that their spouse, or brother, or mother, or sister had died. Well, the agony of those who were burned and maimed. The documents that the government produced in the days following it were not as comprehensive as one would want, and sometimes they provided too much information. See, the job of a chief of staff is, number one, to get to work really early. So I usually get to work like 5:30 in the morning. Number two, to read everything the president was going to read and a lot more. And when I showed up to work, there was a document on my desk that I always look forward to reading, first of all, because everybody else thought they wanted to read it. It was called the President's Daily Brief. It's a very, very, very top secret document. And pretty comprehensive. But it was usually about 10 or 15 pages long at the most. This morning it was like the New York phone book. And I get to work and I see how thick the document is, and I knew I had to read it. I'm starting to plow through it. And I said, darn it, the CIA today is the CYA. Because they didn't do any analysis. They just put all of the threats in there. And then the little locator box in my desk started to flash. And that was a very cool device, because it would tell you where the president always was. The Secret Service controlled the box. They would send their little message into it. And I knew if the president was in the bedroom, in the kitchen, getting up, on his way to work, and it would flash whenever the president started to move. And it was flashing because the president was on his way to the Oval Office. But it would, oh, by the way, the device is so cool, they would also tell me where the First Lady was, the Vice President, the Second Lady, the National Security Advisor, but most exciting, where Jenna and Barbara were. This morning it's flashing, and the president's on his way to work, and I was frustrated because I had a lot to do, and he was showing up 15 minutes early. Oh, I jump from my desk, I run down to the Oval Office, and the president is walking in from the Rose Garden. And I got to exercise a phenomenal privilege that I got to do for 5.5 years and say, "Good morning, Mr. President." And then I said, "Let me tell you what your day is going to be like." And he interrupted me. He said, "I'll tell you what my day is going to be like." That was not comforting when you're the person in charge of his day. But he said, "I want you to get the FBI director over here to give me a briefing." Now you think no big deal. The truth is, FBI directors didn't come to brief the president very often without a large audience around them, because after Watergate, no one wanted the president to be accused of politically influencing the work of the FBI. So this was an unusual request. Really hadn't been much of a request since Watergate. I said, "Yes, sir," and I went out and called the FBI director, who'd only been on the job for 10 days, Bob Mueller. For the chain of command, I called the Attorney General, invited the Attorney General to come, and I said, "Bring a briefer, come over at 8:20, and you can brief the president." I walked in and told the president the FBI director would be here, the Attorney General would be here. And then I went to the senior staff meeting in the West Wing of the White House in the Roosevelt Room, the most functional room in the White House. 20 people sitting around a table. The meeting starts, click, 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 very efficient meeting. At 2 minutes of 8, consistent with past practices, I got up and walked out of the meeting and went into the Oval Office to join the president for his CIA briefing. And then at 8:20 I got up, FBI director was there, briefer, Attorney General, stuck my head back into the Oval Office. The president says, "Bring them in." We all come in. Everybody shuffles around on the couches and in front of the fireplace and chairs in the Oval Office. And the briefer sits right beside the president, and the president turns to the briefer starts the briefing. And it was really, really interesting briefing. It was all about what had happened on September 11th and what they were doing to investigate it. And the president said, "Whoa, I'm really interested in this. But actually of greater importance to me is, what are you doing to prevent the next attack?" And the briefer looks down the couch to the chair at the end of the couch where the FBI director was sitting. The FBI director looks over at the Attorney General. The Attorney General looks back at the briefer looks back at the FBI director, and the FBI director says to the president, "Mr. President, we'll have to get back to you on that one." But it wasn't as bad as it sounds. But it was pretty dramatic. The meeting ended, And as everybody is filing out of the Oval Office, I'm standing beside the grandfather's clock in the Oval Office, and the FBI director turns to the briefer as they're walking out and says, as soon as we get back to the Bureau, we're changing the mission of the FBI. They literally changed the mission of the FBI that day. The #1 mission, to prevent the next attack. If the day had ended then, pretty phenomenal, but it wasn't the end of the day. Next, the president came over to me. I'm still standing beside the grandfather's clock, and he says, Andy, I want to convene at the War Council at Camp David tomorrow. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no such thing as the War Council. There's a National Security Council, and a subset of that is probably the War Council. So I said, yes, sir, and walked out and had my assistant call the right people to invite them to Camp David the next morning for a meeting of the War Council. Pretty memorable day. I go back to the Oval Office, and the president's got someone briefing him, and it was from Cabinet Affairs, and there are all these cue cards for the president. You know, this is what you're supposed to do. We walk into the cabinet room, everybody stands. The president takes a seat, everybody sits. We start with a prayer. Every cabinet meeting I've attended has started with a prayer. Secretary Rumsfeld offered the prayer that day. And after the prayer was spoken, the president turned to the Secretary of State for a report, turned to the Secretary of Defense for a report. And then the cue cards called for him to call on the Secretary of the Treasury. But the president turned the cards over. And he looked up around the table and he said, we are at war. But while we're at war, we have a job to do. And it's a job of government. And with phenomenal specificity, he addressed every member of the cabinet. He talked about, again, with specificity, about the job at HUD and HHS and education and commerce and labor, USTR, the Drug Czar's Office, Office of Management and Budget, state, justice, defense. It was phenomenal. A tour de force. Then we left the cabinet meeting, we piled into limousines, and we all went to the same place, a very large building on the top of a hill in Washington, D.C., the National Cathedral. And every seat, every pew was filled. There were representatives of almost every faith in America, and some phenomenal clergy members addressed us. The Reverend Billy Graham gave us a sermon. We said prayers. We sang hymns. The president addressed us. And he reminded us of a higher calling and a greater duty. And we sang a hymn. And we left. We went to Andrews Air Force Base, and the president got out of the limousine and went up the steps of that 747 with the words, United States of America. And it became Air Force One. And we took off. But we landed in New Jersey at McGuire Air Force Base and were met by the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City. And we left the tarmac and we walked over to a helicopter. General Krulak used to be in charge of those helicopters when he ran the military office at the White House. And we got on that helicopter and it became Marine One as soon as the president got on it. And we lifted off and we flew right over the Statue of Liberty. And she was beautiful. The sun is glistening off the torch, but the sky was strange. It was strange because there were no planes in it. It was quiet. And then we got to the tip of Manhattan, and there was a pillar of black smoke coming out of a very large, dark hole. And we circled around that pillar of smoke, and no one said a word. We were pressed against the windows, and you saw thousands of people around the edge of that hole. Then the helicopter landed down by Wall Street. We piled into Suburbans. We start working our way through the streets of New York. Now, I've been to New York many times with presidents, and the reactions are always very interesting. It's a mixture of cheers and sneers. Frequently, there are lots of single-digit hellos. That was not the case on this trip. We're working our way to what we now call Ground Zero. And the streets are lined by people behind police barricades, but all of the people had hard hats on. They were the rescue workers. And President Bush said to the Secret Service, "Stop the limo, I want to get out." The Secret Service was not happy. Nobody had gone through a magnetometer, and nobody had had their Social Security number run through a computer system. But the president got out, and he started walking down the police line, and people are kind of greeting him all different ways, and he's shaking hands. And then someone starts chanting, "USA, USA." Then the president works his way to a crushed vehicle. And then the president gets up on the crushed vehicle and stands beside a firefighter, Bob Beckwith. The president's handed a bullhorn. And the crowd is chanting, "USA, USA!" And then somebody yells out, "I can't hear you!" And the president says, "I hear you, and the whole world will hear us." Pretty memorable. By the way, those chants of USA, I look over to my left and I see people chanting USA, USA, and they had Japanese flags on their uniforms. And a team of search and rescue dogs, the handlers, are chanting USA, USA, and they had Canadian flags on their uniforms. A lot of people around the world that weren't citizens of the USA were chanting USA, USA. If the day had ended then, unbelievable. But it didn't. We piled into the Suburbans and we drove to the Jacob Javits Center. Now, the Jacob Javits Center is a mammoth convention hall. We went right inside of it, and there are all of these booths. And you know the booths, the pipe and the blue drape. And in every booth, there were teams of rescue workers. And they came from every state in the Union and 38 other countries. And they were the next round of rescue workers. The president went to every single booth, thanked them for being there, took his picture with them, rallied them on, and then the president, exhausted, gets in the limousine and thinks we're going to leave the building, but we didn't leave the building. Instead, we took a left, inside the building, and went to another section. And there was a big, big blue draped room. And the Suburban stopped, and the Secret Service opened the door. When the president got out, the advanced man says, "Mr. President, we've got a microphone set up, a little stage. The thought is that you would make some brief remarks to some of these people, maybe stay 15, 20 minutes. And the president said, "Well, who's in the room?" And he said, "Well, we've gathered some of the families of the policemen and firemen that are missing down at the World Trade Center." And the president says, "I am not going to the microphone." And he just walks into the room. The Secret Service didn't lead the way. The president led the way. No one in the room expected it. They didn't stand up. They didn't line up. But the president went to them. And he went to every single person in the room. And there was tremendous hope. Oh, there was hope. My husband will be okay. My son's a professional. He'll get out. There was tremendous fear. There was anger. Lots of tears. was some laughter, lots of hugs. The president stayed there for about an hour and 40 minutes. Went to every single person in that room. As he's getting ready to leave, he walks by a woman who was actually one of the first people he saw when he walked into the room. She was sitting against a column, and her family was gathered around her, and she stood up and walked right up to the president and held out her hand. Mr. President, I want you to have this. This is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him. And she dropped the badge in the president's hand. We're all crying. The president is crying. I'll never forget the president, with tears in his eyes, looks at Mrs. Howard. And he says, America will forget. We'll move on. That's our nature. But you do not have to worry about me. I will never forget. With tears streaming down his cheeks, he took that badge and he put it in his pocket. And we walked out of the room. We piled into the back of the limousine. And on the way to the helicopter, the president reaches into his pocket, takes out the badge, opens his hand, and there it is. Badge number 1012. The president squeezes it, doesn't say a word, puts it in his pocket. He gets out of the limousine when we arrive at the landing zone. He goes over and he takes his picture with the policemen and firemen who were protecting Marine One. The staff all piles in the limousine. And then we take off and we head over to Air Force One. Only this time it's not the 747. The staff went to the 747. We went to a very small jet. And when the president climbed the stairs and got on that jet, it became Air Force One. And the door was shut. Only a few people. The pilot, the co-pilot, a communications officer, a doctor, military aide with a football, a nurse, Secret Service agents, me, and the president. And I'm sitting right opposite the president at a little table. The plane rumbles down the runway, and it starts to climb. And the president is slouching in his seat. He's exhausted. I'm sure he's physically exhausted. I think he's mentally exhausted. I think he's emotionally exhausted. I believe he's spiritually exhausted. And I said to the president, Mr. President, you are a great president. And he looks up at me like, what? I said, you did everything a president could be expected to do. You changed the mission of a federal bureaucracy. As Commander-in-Chief, you called for the convening of the War Council. As the head of government, you reminded us that while we were at war, we had a job of governing to do. You reminded us of a higher power, and you prayed for us in the world. You told the world they would hear us. You rallied the rescue workers, and you comforted the victims. He looks up at me, and all he said was, thank you. The plane landed at Hagerstown, Maryland, right near Camp David. That was my most memorable day at the White House. I feel very, very comfortable in standing before audiences and talking about September 11th. I feel very uncomfortable that they think I'm talking about my role that day. No, I'm keeping my promise that the president made, because we said we would never forget. So with that, I'd be glad to take questions on any topic you want. But understand, presidents make a difference. And the leadership that they're required to offer sometimes doesn't come in the way they intended. President Bush didn't take the oath of office paying as much attention to it as he did the day I whispered into his ear. When he took the office, chances are he was thinking about his inaugural address. But when he was in that classroom, with that look on his face, with the innocence of children in front of him, I think he said, it's about them. And it's about my obligation to preserve, protect, and defend. And you know what? There is no conditional clause to that oath. It doesn't say if it's easy. It doesn't say if everyone agrees. It doesn't say if I've got support where I need it. It doesn't even say if the French are on board. But it is an obligation that every president accepts, and I'm really proud to have served 3 presidents who understood the obligation. With that, thank you, God bless you, and I look forward to your questions.
Tell them you take the hand.
General Krulak just gave me a command. And I respect commands from General Krulak. But he said, tell them you'll take the hard ones. I want your questions. I really do want your questions. And I want them to be the questions that you're afraid to ask me, but that you really have. So please don't be bashful. I'd ask you just to be respectful of others, so try not to give speeches, but I'd be glad to answer your questions, and they can be on any topic or any angst that you have. The good news is, I do know that Constitution, and if I have to plead the fifth, I will. Does anybody have a question? Yes, come right up. Come up to the microphone. Tell me a little bit about who you are before you ask me a question.
I'm Becca Schulteis, and I'm a freshman here. What would you say makes the best leaders in the world? Like, what qualities would you say you could find in the students here?
What makes the best leaders in the world, and what qualities would I suggest that?
The students here.
Sure. First of all, I hope everyone learns how to be a leader. But I also hope that you recognize if everyone is a leader, no one's a leader. Okay? So, the question is, do you have the courage to be a leader? There's a book by Michael Beschloss, who is a historian, that I have commended to my children and grandchildren. And yes, I'm old enough to have grandchildren. And I'm wonderfully blessed to have a family that makes a difference. But Michael Beschloss's book is pretty remarkable because it's called Presidential Courage. And it came out probably about 6 years ago. And it told the story of presidents in a different way than I had heard them when I was a student. And it talked about the presidents that we know and respect and study, you know, George Washington and John Adams and Abraham Lincoln, and more. But it talked about the courage that they need to make a difference as a president. And maybe the easiest way to say it is, if you're going to be a leader, you really have to have the courage to be lonely. And if you want to be a politician, that means you have to be schizophrenic. Because when you run for president or run for office, You are a love magnet. You want everybody to love you. And you love everybody back. But when you become president or the CEO or governor or mayor, you find that you have to make the decisions that will cause people not to love you. And that takes a lot of courage. To have the courage to be lonely, to do the right thing. But I also try to say it succinctly with you, I cannot imagine being a good leader and not being grounded in faith. Because leaders don't make easy decisions, they make tough decisions. And they get people to do things that they might not want to do, or they might not be inspired to do. So good leaders have to convince people to have that leap of faith to follow you, and then you have to inspire them to do the best job that they can. So the courage to be lonely. You have to be an optimist. If you're a pessimist, you cannot be a leader. Because no one wants to follow a pessimist. Follow me, things will get worse. So you've got to be an optimist. So study leadership, but understand being a leader is different than studying it. I also pray that you will have the courage to recognize leadership. There are some false leaders in the world. So that's where you need kind of divine guidance and a good gut. But discerning leadership is almost as important as exercising leadership. And there's also something called the Peter Principle. And there are leaders that lead beyond their ability. And I've worked with some of them too. They were perfect here and not so perfect when they got there. So I don't know that I'm helping you at all, but that's what I would say makes a difference. Have faith, be optimistic, have the courage to be lonely, and be a discerning leader as you inspire. Right there, come to a microphone so that I'm older than I want to be and not as, my ears aren't young. Maybe that's the best way to say it.
I'm Anna Scott. I'm a senior here. I'm the definition of uninvolved. I'm a chemistry major. I know very little about politics. And you talked about at the beginning having healthy discussions and accepting the invitation, but as an average person who doesn't pay attention most of the time, seems like most of the conversations are unhealthy discussions, which is discouraging, and why would you want to go to a party where everyone's being negative? What do you say to convince me otherwise?
You are defining America for a lot of people today. How many people don't want to show up to a party because it's discouraging today? And party takes on many different labels in the world of politics. I happen to be excited about politics, so it's easy to get me to come to a party, even if everybody else is boring. But I really get involved. But I feel very, very strongly that the danger in a democracy is apathy. Okay? The challenge to a democracy is passion. And that's sometimes a good challenge and sometimes a bad challenge. This is a controversial statement I'm going to make, but it comes from experience in both the legislative branch, where I had to be, it is so hard to be a Republican state legislator in the Massachusetts House. I was completely irrelevant. So I had to be knowledgeable so that I took advantage of the rules. So I knew what rules, have you ever been to a legislative body where they talk real fast? It's kind of like going to an auction and you never know what the auctioneer is saying. Well, I move suspension of paragraph 29, rule 2B, section 4A1. Any objection, no objection, so by order. That was it. Well, I read the rules so that I knew if they said I move suspension of paragraph 29 of rule 21, I could say, that requires unanimous consent. I object! Everybody would come to me and say, what, are you doing this? I said, I just want to know what's going on. If you come and tell me what's going on before you do it, I won't object. And it made a big difference. But the truth is, apathy is bad. So I don't want you to be apathetic. I want you to get over it and get involved. But I also, this is the controversial thing. How many of you know exactly what should be done? I see a few hands going up. The truth is, all of you, you have perfection in you. I know you do. And I have found a lot of people in politics are perfectionists, and they run on perfection. They run. I have the right answer, I've got the perfect solution, and sometimes you're excited by it. And you want to support that perfection. But guess what? I have found that perfection is almost never the result of a democracy. Well, I'm for perfection. I always want it introduced. But if I can't count on it being the result, I want the perfectionists to have the courage to work for perfectly good. If you are a perfectionist and you serve in Congress, and you don't have the courage to work for perfectly good, I have found you become irrelevant in Congress. And I had to work a lot with Congress. And I had to deal with a lot of perfectionists. The ones that said, I'll work for perfectly good, made a difference. The ones that said, no, I will remain perfect, never became part of the solution. So we're in the midst of a campaign for president. And there'll be lots of campaigns to Congress and the United States Senate and for governor and other things. And there will be perfect solutions offered. Unfortunately, perfect is like art. What's perfect to one is imperfect to another. So it's kind of how you perceive it. Motives aren't bad, and perfection is good. But it does vary from thoughtful person to thoughtful person. I just want the people who are representing me, and we live in a republic. Our government is not a pure democracy. We live in a republic. We have representatives in our system of government. I want our representatives to work hard enough to make government work, rather than to have government fail to meet obligations. So I am someone who is not arguing that perfectionists should rule the day. I'm actually arguing that perfectionists should participate in the day and have the courage to work for perfectly good so that government can function. And that's what I look for in a candidate, and that's what I look for in the leadership of our Congress and our governments, state, local, and federal. And so put me in that camp. I don't know whether that's, I worked with some amazing people, and I would actually have the courage to say they were perfect examples. But they were perfect examples because they found the way to work for perfectly good. And at the top of my list would be George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, and James A. Baker III. I really, really do respect them. I watched Ronald Reagan up close and personal. My job was the liaison to the nation's governors for President Reagan. Talk about a great job to have with a president who had been a governor. He cared a lot about the governors. It didn't even make any difference what party they came from or what their philosophy was. He cared about the governors. He always wanted to know about them. Sometimes he just wanted to know the gossip. And so that gave me a disproportionate opportunity to have a relationship with President Reagan because he wanted to talk about the governors. Is he fooling around on his wife? He loved the gossip. But he also liked working with different people. And he did work with different people. And you remember, nobody thought that he could get along with Tip O'Neill, but they actually got along really well. They got along better than they governed together. And I miss that. So, next question, please. Yes? Microphone, please, and then we'll go to the back of the room so your hands up. So far, these are not the tough questions that General Krulak was ordering from all of you.
My name is Ferris Basha. I'm a senior biology major.
Speak nice and loud to that microphone, sir.
Oh, sorry.
People in the back of the room want to hear you.
I'm Ferris Pasha, senior here. Really, this is the greatest country in the world. I completely agree with you. My whole family and where I'm from is in Syria, where it's not so good. So I appreciate the love for this country. My question to you is, was there ever a time when you felt that you couldn't do it anymore? And if so, specifically what time?
Was there ever a time when I felt I couldn't do it anymore? Yeah.
It's too much to handle.
No, I never felt that. You know, I felt phenomenally blessed. The truth is I overstayed my welcome. But I never felt that I couldn't do the job. I was really tired. If you're looking for a career, do not be the president's chief of staff. The average tenure for a chief of staff is a little bit less than 2 years. So you won't vest in a pension system. I did it for 5.5 years. The longest serving chief of staff to any president was a fellow by the name of Sherman Adams, and he was Dwight David Eisenhower's chief of staff, and he served for 5 years and 9 months. If you count from the time the president put me in the slot to the time that I left, I was there for 5 years and 6 months. I didn't know I was 3 months away from the record. But at any rate, it was a phenomenal blessing, and I loved every single day of it. The president should have loved me for about 180 fewer days, however. But it's a tough job. It was grueling. I had one vacation in 5.5 years. And on day 2 of the vacation, Hurricane Katrina hit. And I said to my wife, don't worry, Joe Hagan, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, he can handle it. He was traveling with the president. And my wife says, you're going to have to go back. And I said, no, Joe can handle it. And I'm talking to the president, and the president said, stay on vacation. I should have taken a hint then. But it was a phenomenal experience, but I did go back. And one of the great frustrations of serving as Chief of Staff to the president was seeing what we didn't do well in the context of Katrina. And there's no excuse for me not having done a little bit better job, because I had been sent by the first President Bush to be the person to respond to Hurricane Andrew when it struck Florida and Louisiana. So I had the experience of working on a significant disaster, which was the biggest disaster in the history of the country up until that time. But can I do something else? When you said you're from Syria, are you a U.S. citizen? He is. How many of you are naturalized citizens? Do you know what a naturalized citizen is? Okay, well, naturalized citizens are people who were not born here, but they wanted to be here. Okay. Most of us are citizens by the accident of birth. Our mothers dropped us here. A naturalized citizen is someone very different, because they actually wanted to become a citizen, and they applied for it. And they probably stood in line for a long time, sometimes years and years and years. And they prayed that their name would be called. And when it was called, they got a not very fancy invitation. But the invitation was to go to school, because they actually had to read the Declaration of Independence. They had to read the Constitution. They had to read the Gettysburg Address. They had to memorize the Pledge of Allegiance. They had to be able to sing, not necessarily on key, the national anthem. They also, remember the television show Schoolhouse Rock? I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. They had to be able to pass a test about how a bill becomes law. And then they got this invitation, also not very fancy, if they passed all the tests at the school. And it said, please show up. And it could be show up at a judge's office, an immigration office, could be football stadium, could be a gymnasium. And you got the invitation, and you said, I'm going to have to put on my very best clothes for this one. And people get all dressed up. And when they show up, there's usually somebody hanging around with American flags, and they start passing them out. And everybody stands in line, even though they don't have to get an American flag. And they walk in. And then the judge or the immigration official comes up and says, wow, it's terrific to see you. And you look around the room, and no one looks like you do. They're all different. They're all different. And the judge says, would you please stand? And everybody stands up. He said, would you raise your right hand? And the judge says, will you promise to give up all of your allegiances in the past? Any king, queen, potentate, any big shot, will you give up that allegiance? Will you pledge allegiance to the United States of America? Will you promise to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic? If the government calls and says they need help, will you say yes? Will you join the military if the government asks you to? If they say, will you join us in civilian service, will you say yes? And then the judge says, are you crazy? Do you know what you're doing? This is a very big deal. Are you a sound mind? Do you understand this? And the judge says, you know what? It's not good enough for you to just tell me. You've actually got to tell a higher power. And when they say, I do, the judge says some pretty phenomenal words. And the people who hear these words, almost every one of them says it's the happiest day of their life. Because the words are, welcome, fellow citizen. Those of us whose mothers dropped us here never had to make the promise. But the truth is, we have the same obligation. And it's pretty amazing when we think we support our Constitution by exercising our First Amendment right to complain about it. And how many of us answer the call? This is the anniversary day. Maybe it was yesterday, maybe it's tomorrow. I think it was about this day in 1969. I don't know where you were in 1969, but those of you who were around in 1969 and over the age of 18, remember it was kind of a scary time because there was a lottery that started today and nobody wanted to win it with a low number. It was the draft lottery. And that lottery meant you didn't have a choice. You accepted the invitation if it came. Today, if you serve in the military, every single person who is serving is there because they volunteered. Thank them for accepting the invitation because nobody twisted their arm to do it. And they make it possible for us to be here and to talk about it. Another question. I got to go to the back of the room. Yes, and way down back. Come on up to a microphone. Speak nice and loud.
I'm Colin Hills. I'm a junior here. My question to you, Mr. Card, is, well, it's kind of a two-part question. First, it's easy to talk about what makes you proud of your government in regard to a defining moment like 9/11. What I want to know is what you think the low point during your tenure in government of this government was,
Of the what?
The low point of our government, what that was, and what made you proud to be a part of that.
What were the low points for me? There were low points. I already mentioned Katrina. Boy, that was frustrating with Katrina. And part of the frustration is the president didn't have all the power that people thought he had. Governors actually have to request assistance during a disaster. The president can't just deliver it. He can offer it, he can promise it, but he can't impose it. And we had lots of lawyers telling the president that he couldn't send troops down there unless there was a constitutionally declared insurrection, because the Constitution only allows troops to be sent in without the governor's invitation if there's been an insurrection. And so we couldn't find any lawyers that would claim that Katrina was an insurrection. So that was a challenge. We had to get the governor to request it in Louisiana. The governor in Mississippi made the request. The governor of Louisiana was a bigger challenge. So, but that was an all-night Andy Card up dealing with lawyers and the Department of Defense and National Guard Bureau and all that kind of stuff, and governors. That was very hard. But that was Katrina was a low point for me, because I felt frustrated for the president because he had different expectations and they were not being met. And that continued for a long time as agencies didn't do what the president wanted to have done. So that was a frustration. The war in Iraq, gosh, I know you all had questions about it, but you're chicken to answer, asking questions. You have one right there, you want one. I know it's super, super, super controversial. And I can tell you this, no president ever wants to send young men and women into harm's way. No one wants them to make sacrifices that they make. None, zero. So please do not believe President Bush wanted to go to war. He did not want to go to war. But it was an extremely challenging time. We talk about 9/11 very quickly. 9/11, that was a dramatic time because it also changed the foreign policy of America. And the foreign policy change is still embraced by President Obama. Our foreign policy prior to September 11, 2001 was responsive to an attack. Now our foreign policy is preventive to an attack. And the president made it very clear in his very first address to the American people from the Oval Office, and then later on in subsequent addresses, when he said, you're either with us or against us. A big message went out to a lot of world leaders. You're either with us or against us. You know what happens if you straddle a fence. I'm going to make sure the fence gets too high and you're going to be uncomfortable in the wrong spot. So you better come down on one side of the fence. And General Musharraf, I'm sure he's going, don't make me choose, please don't make me choose. And Colonel Gaddafi, he's the first one, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you, I am with you. Don't bomb me. And Saddam Hussein, he answered it by saying, oh yeah, I'm going to give a reward for every family of suicide bombers. And all you weapons inspectors over there from the UN staying at that hotel, you can't even go out of your rooms anymore. So that was the world when we had to contemplate what to do about where could terrorists be harbored, where could terrorists mount attacks from, and how do we prevent the next attack, and how do we convince the world that we're serious. So the war in Iraq was not something that the president wanted. In fact, he didn't want the war in Afghanistan. That message of you're either with us or against us was actually delivered to the Taliban leadership too. And the option was presented to them, turn Osama bin Laden over to us and shut down all of those training camps. And Mullah Omar and the Taliban didn't really answer the call. So there was not a lot of bloodthirst in the White House, contrary to the myth. There were some serious conversations, and no president wants to see young men and women maimed or dead. And that is a reality. One more question, because I think General Krulak, Yes, go right ahead.
My name's Sarah McKeon. I'm a senior here. And my question is, well, it's actually a reflection on what Anna said about apathy in our generation. I participated in the election in 2008 on our campus as a freshman, and people were really excited and really active. But I've been watching the debates recently with the Republicans, and I have to say I'm pretty disappointed with both the Republican and the Democratic Party. So how do you think we should define Republican in today's context?
How do I think you should define Republicans? Or, okay. Well, I am unabashedly a Republican. I came from a district that was 6-1 Democrat, and I had the courage to run in that district. But I would define a Republican as someone who shares a philosophy that the government closest to the people is the most effective government, and the government furthest away from the people is the most abusive government. So I'm a small government celebrator, and I prefer to have, I would like to have as many choices in life as possible. And I'd like to have the opportunity to make my own mistakes. I don't want the government to take all of my risks away. I'm willing to take risks. So I'm someone who celebrates risk opportunity. I want to be smart about it. And I need government, and I need regulation, and I need to make sure that there are rules. I'm a rule of law person, but I'm a smaller government. I'm also someone who believes that the resources that you pay to the government are precious resources, and they should be respected as precious and not spent inappropriately or abused. But I also think we all have an obligation to make sure our country is a country. So I support our defense budgets. And I want to help to make sure that America is secure and that our beacon is bright as it shines around the world, because there are billions of people in this world and millions of them are looking for our beacon. So I'm not an isolationist. I want to be engaged with the world. I'm a free trader. I'm someone who believes in economic opportunity, and I also don't think failure is wrong as long as you have the courage to learn from it and succeed later on. I don't want to keep people in failure, and I don't want to limit people so that they only fail. I want to create opportunities. But that's the difference. I'm a small government person. Yes, I'm proud to be a Republican. There are some Republicans, you know, people say, Andy, who's qualified to be president? I get that question a lot. And I say, anyone who was born here and is over age 35. Now, if they say who's ready to be president, I have lots of opinions. But qualified, there are a lot of people qualified. How many people are ready? Not that many. How many people are ready that have the courage to run for it? Even fewer. But our system, by the way, I talked about the great Constitution, and it talks about Article 2, the President, Article 1, Congress, all this kind of stuff. You know what it does not talk about? A two-party system. There's no reference to how we pick who's going to be president. Whoa, the founding fathers, what happened? Well, the truth is, they liked each other when they wrote the document, and they didn't after they started to serve it. And the Constitution is written, says that the president and the vice president will be, the president gets the most votes in the Electoral College, and the vice president gets the second most votes. That was amended because the president and the second place finisher didn't talk to each other. So, the two-party system is really important. How many of you have traveled in other countries? How many have been to Europe? Okay. I travel to Europe and around the world quite a bit. And when I go to Europe, it's so exciting to me, but it's also frustrating because they celebrate democracy in Europe, and they're pretty proud about it. And they don't have quite the same First Amendment rights that we have, but they exercise ours too, especially when they talk about us. And when I'm over in Europe, I get frequently, what is the matter with your country? And I say, absolutely nothing. And they say, no, the president says he wants to do this, and Congress won't do it. And I said, well, that's because he's Article 2 and Congress is Article 1. And they said, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I said, well, your system of democracy is a parliamentary system. Your prime minister makes a decision, and if the legislative body doesn't like it, there's another election. Because the ministers are all in the parliament. And if the prime minister can't make the parliament do what it wants, the people lose confidence in the parliament, and there's a no confidence vote in the prime minister, and there's a new election. They don't understand our two-party system. They don't understand executive, legislative, and judicial. For the vast majority of democracies around the world, and they're great democracies, there's no separation of power. So our presidents, you know, they're remarkable. The Constitution says the president will be the voice to the world for America, foreign policy voice. Congress ends up, you know, authorizing money or trying to limit the volume of the voice or something else, but the president speaks for us to the world. The president is also the commander-in-chief, and because of that, General Krulak would say, yes, sir, and not question it. Congress, they view the president's orders as a suggestion. And far too many of them, during my experience as chief of staff to the president, would say, yes means maybe, and no means maybe not. And there are seldom consequences unless the president gets on a pulpit and says, I'm shining the spotlight on you. And politicians love spotlights when they're not trained on them. So the system of government is different, and guess what I've done? I think I've overstayed my welcome with you the same way I did when I was chief of staff. So I'm going to close it by saying you have a great leader at this institution. And this institution, I've done a little bit of homework about. This institution has a great legacy. And it's got a great present. And some of you wonder about the future. The future is a function of the present. This campus is like spectacularly beautiful. It's kind of this is a postcard perfect campus. If you think of a college, you could easily be in Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, whereas where I see the most perfect college campuses. You don't have a ski area nearby though. But it's a beautiful campus with beautiful buildings, highly respected and highly regarded faculty, and students that I've been phenomenally impressed with because they ask great questions and they have terrific perspective. The future is bright for this school as long as you hold the torch high. General Krulak is a leader of leaders. He's a leader of leaders. I have watched him be a leader of leaders. I've watched him lead people that were told they didn't have to follow commands. And he did that phenomenally well. Obviously, he was a great leader of people who did have to follow commands. You are blessed to have his leadership at this college. I hope that you will take advantage of it. And I hope you will all find a way to get involved. And I hope you'll all pick up a torch and hold it very high so that others will see that you're lighting the way to the future rather than worried about the recent past. Thank you, and God bless you.